Welcome to today's presentation for peak oil. Planning roughly about 1 hour, may get a little longer. When I made this same presentation from this same slide or outline 2 years ago, and some people may have been present at that time, oil back then, exactly 2 years ago, in February 2006, was $60 at that time of my presentation about peak oil. Back then, I predicted it by the end of 2007, oil will hit $100, and that caused an outrage in the room. Everyone was, just became like a hive. That's impossible. Do you understand that a $40 rise on a basis of 60 is like 60 or 70%? Do you know or realize what the consequences will be? Then they were questioned, well, where is your econometric model to make such an outrageous forecast? Well, I turned out to be mostly wrong by a couple of cents. Sure, it hit close to $99 on New Year's Eve of 2007, but the first trading day of 2008 vindicated my forecast. We hit $100. Well, since then, 100 has been a major resistance. You're all in investment club, should understand what this concept means. It was tested for 3 times. And today, let's say 21st of February 2008, is a especially good day to make this presentation. Why? Oil just flew through $100 yesterday, closed above 100, and again today was at some point almost $101. So again, oil is pushing higher and higher a month and a half, 2 months later, which means that this whole oil thing is not a fluke, it's not random, and is not what is usually portrayed in the media to be speculators driving prices higher, or greedy oil companies trying to make money out of poor people and whatnot. So basically today's lecture is about what we do in economics: basic supply and basic demand. Peak oil specifically refers more to a supply condition rather than a demand condition. But the fundamental problem, and for you guys being an investment club, the ultimate question is one and one only. Is the price going to go up or is it going to go down? If it goes up, you should take a long position, and if it goes down, a short position. So, the very beginning, the problem, at least for the last 7 years, has been simple: constantly rising oil prices. So, that's the price, and then we get to which are the fundamental factors determining price. Well, number 1, growing demand, and number 2, dwindling supply, and number 3, because oil is denominated in US dollars, the ever weaker dollar, which is based on fundamental weakness of the US economy associated with welfare warfare state, meaning that the US runs phenomenal budget deficits, which the government and the Fed promptly monetizes. This allows a phenomenal increase in the money supply of US dollars across the world, and therefore a substantial weakening of the dollar. Given the circumstances, each of these is a fundamental, powerful factor that drives the price higher and higher. Let's click back to the chart on the big picture underneath and take a look at what is the big picture looking like. Well, the blue chart over here, the blue line, shows supply. This supply is meant to be interpreted in a very specific but common sense way. It is meant to be interpreted as barrels of oil that can be pumped out of the ground for 1 day or for a specific period of time. This does not refer specifically to how much oil we have in the ground or how much we have pumped. It is related to it, but this simply refers to our maximum capacity to pump oil out of the ground in one day, whether it's 50 million barrels or 6 million barrels a day or 80 million barrels a day, whatever that is. And then you have the demand. Now we're in a position, probably somewhere in here, we are already past peak. These are all the latest indications. Turns out something else happened. At the time that I made the lecture in February, just a couple of months later, according to some of the world's foremost authorities, peak oil was actually hit or realized in, according to some experts, late 2005, according to other experts in early 2006. So in this sense, 2006 denotes the peak, and it's been slowly decreasing in terms of rate. It's been slowly decreasing. So a gap is opening up, and that gap must be somehow rationed. Well, elementary economics, at least introductory macro, the major or the main purpose of prices and rising prices is to ration a scarce or relatively scarce resource, to ration it to those that will most efficiently use that scarce resource. So that's basically the big picture. Let's look back at this demand. What is the driver of the demand? Back then, the big driver was the BRIC story. You should all know by now what BRIC means. It means Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These are the 4 fastest growing and developing economies in the world, averaging a growth rate of roughly 9%, at least up to 2007. Now credit crunch, God knows what happens, different story altogether. So these are countries that are industrializing, and industrialization is done with one way. A lot of energy and a host of other natural resources. So demand is steady, it is growing. The demand from these countries grows at rates much faster than from Western Europe or the US. Actually, for Western Europe and US, demand has been pretty much rationed out. In other words, the rising price means that the actual consumption hasn't increased much or at all. Gains in the economy has been accomplished by increasing efficiency or increasing way better utilization of the existing stocks of oil. So, what is new here, or has turned out to be new over the last 2 or 3 years, is that the fastest demand for oil in the world has been over the last 2 or 3 years. Anybody? From where? In the world? US. No. The Middle East itself. Fastest growth in the world, demand for crude oil is Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. These countries are growing at the fastest rates in the world. United Arab Emirates has the 2nd fastest growth in the world, right after Afghanistan, right? So, these guys are not buying economy cars. You know, they begin with an M5. You know what's an M5, right? It begins out the M5. They begin with 5-liter engines and up. They start out with Corvettes. That's the cheap sports car. So, these guys are buying the 4, 5, 6-liter cars, and they are consuming an awful lot. Plus, they're industrializing themselves. Saudi Arabia is building out a couple of cities, which means that they will require an awful lot of demand. So, the fastest growing demand, 2% annually of crude oil, is coming from oil-producing countries themselves, which means that whatever they produce, a little less is left for exports in the rest of the world. All right, so What is itself peak oil? Peak oil itself refers to the concept, not that we're running out of oil, there are plenty, hundreds of billions of dollars of oil left, refers to the rate with which we can pump out oil in a particular period of time, typically one day. And peak oil refers to the world's inability to expand millions of dollars of barrels per day. So if we reach, let's say, 78, there is no way, and we don't have the ability to pump 79 or 90. Economists on this one have to understand there are two fundamental schools. One is the geologist school, and the other one is the economist school. Geologists have been for 7 years in a row, or 6 years in a row, perfectly correct about what's going on with oil. Simple reason they actually understand oil and how, somebody gets oil out of the ground. And economists have been dead wrong over and over and over again. Economists are doing a model after a model, and the general rule of thumb is that more complicated the econometric model, the ultimate result is worse. Of course, the biggest or one of the best authorities in the world is called CERA, which stands for Cambridge Energy Research Associates. This is Daniel Yergin. He is considered one of the greatest in all, at least amongst the mainstream and Wall Street and governments and everybody else interested in oil. Of course, everybody who understands anything about oil knows that he is not that competent, but more importantly, all of his forecasts and analyses are grossly distorted for political and other reasons. But I have been able to pull up a chart here on Dan Yergin. Let's see if we can click on the side, if that will come up. Yes, that's a great chart for anybody in investing, and anyone wanting to learn about investing, is that sometimes getting the greatest and the top authorities, which are, you got to understand, most popular amongst governments and amongst Wall Street themselves, usually get it dead wrong all the time for many, many years in a row. And this is the most absurd part. Look at it here. The guy saying oil will average $20 a barrel. Well, it's up close to 30. He was roughly 50% off. In other words, price went up 50%. He didn't see it. That's okay. We all make these kind of mistakes. But that's 2002. Have more fun again. Late 2002, he says, oh, oil will be back in the 20s. The price proved him wrong again. Here is another one. Oil will be in the high 20s to low 30s by 2006. Whoa. Turns out that the price was double. As you can see, every time these guys, meaning world's foremost experts, make a prediction, the market proves them wrong. Make a prediction, another. Make a prediction, another mistake. Make a prediction, another mistake. On the way up, they were predicting price down, and on the way up, the interesting part to note is that arrows are flat or going down from January of 2002 all the way to the beginning of 2008. 6 consecutive years in a row, these top experts get it wrong. It is even more absurd. There's nothing wrong about somebody, or meaning the world's foremost institution, getting it wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. They do it all the time. The real question is why the rest of the world is, let's call it, naive enough or stupid enough to keep trusting these guys after seeing them for 6 years in a row that they got it wrong. I mean, sure, they can get it wrong. Everybody can get anything wrong. But if you see him for 6 years in a row that he's consistently wrong, why the rest of the world trusts him? Well, again, they, meaning Daniel Yergin, who's the chief of CERA, just say peak oil doesn't exist, it's wrong, it's No, all the bad stuff about it. So let's have and understand some basics about peak oil, and these basics associate or mix a little bit of economics with a little bit of geology. So moving to part 4, and part 4 first is bear market of the 80s and 90s. Basically, oil made a phenomenal run-up from roughly $1, $1.20 in late 60s, all the way to $45 in 1980. It peaked there, in other words, it went up 30 times. And from there, 1980, all the way to 2001, oil has been in a bear market. Bear market for oil means that profits were low, occasionally negative, price going down. It didn't make sense to invest, but it made more sense to consolidate. So 20 years of bear market mean, from an investment point of view, lack of investments or underinvesting in the industry. Well, in reality, the industry had major overcapacity by 1980, and that overcapacity got worked off one step at a time. But in the 90s, a major lack of capacity developed, which started to surface roughly in early 2000, with the rise of the BRIC countries. So once BRIC countries started sucking a lot of oil, it became obvious that there isn't enough capacity. So that's number one. Number two is that there has been no great oil discovery in the last 25 years. This means that Kashagan oil field, which country was that? One of the Russian countries, right? Former Russian countries. But nothing big, nothing major. In other words, for the last 25 years, we've been consuming phenomenal amount of oil, 70, 80 million barrels per day. This translates into billions, of course, for a year. So we consume it and still not find anything, have found anything big or major for the last 25 years. Well, there's got to be some limit if you're consuming more, but you aren't finding enough. Second, or another big reason, is a decadal time lag for oil. What does it mean? It means something very simple. Alright, let's try and find oil. We drill and we get lucky, meaning we strike oil. The oil is there and you have billions of barrels. Can we begin pumping today? Of course, no. That's at least what I teach in introductory macro. You need what we call the capital structure, or the capital infrastructure. You gotta, just because you have the oil, well, you gotta build the oil wells. They require a lot of technology and metal and everything else. You gotta drill sometimes 1 kilometer, sometimes 2 in the ground. You gotta secure those oil wells. So you got the oil wells up and running, and you're ready to pump a couple of thousand barrels, let's say 50,000 barrels a day or 100,000 barrels a day. You get to pump them out, and then what? Well, you need a pipeline. Once the oil is in the ground, you're getting it out on the surface, you need a major pipeline to get it somewhere. Well, somewhere will be, let's say, to U.S. consumers. Well, the pipeline can't go to the U.S. from Kashagan, right? It's got to go to the port. So there's got to be an oil terminal port where you got to have the tankers. So you're pumping that oil, well, first, you got to have the terminal. Well, you got to build it. Well, terminals got their capacity. If you're pumping more, you got to build another terminal. So the point is, you got to build the oil wells, then you got to have the pipeline, then you got to have the terminals on the European side, or let's say the Middle East side. Oh, but you got to have the terminals on the US side. Oh, but that's not good enough. You got to have a refinery, because we can't run our cars on oil. We run them on gasoline, at least in US, or mostly on diesel in Europe. The point is, it takes a phenomenal capital infrastructure, and it doesn't take 1 year to build it out. it usually takes roughly 10 years. If you get to really accelerate the process, and government and everybody is cooperating, and banks are just throwing billions in investments, yes, it is possible to shorten it down to 7 years. But 7 years is still a long, long time lag. And what was the if at the beginning? You actually strike and actually find the billions of dollars, sorry, billions of barrels in the ground. But the problem is we haven't even done that for the last 25 years. All right, so here's another problem. I explained the capital structure, but the very last piece of the puzzle is the refinery itself. In the US, it turns out to be a total nightmare to build a refinery. First, let's see. Last refinery was built in 1975. So the average age of a US refinery is how much? Well, if the youngest refinery is, let's see, last is 75. So if the youngest refinery is 30-some years old, the average refinery is 60 years old. All right? First. Second, you need in the United States 800 different permits for all the specific pieces to build a refinery. How can you get 800? Well, the answer is you can't. And if you're a major oil company, meaning the biggest oil company in the world, you still can't. And if you're the president, US president, and you want to help your oil buddies, you know, because they're his buddies, right? They still can't. He still cannot help them, you know, their courts and all the other stuff. So it turns out that this in itself, the refinery, to actually get the crude oil into a consumable product, could be engine oil or anything else, is still a big, big, big major problem. All right, so the next thing to understand is that the findings in terms of crude oil in the ground peaked in the late 1960s. So what we have is a curve where from year to year, from decade to decade, you find more and more and more. And the decade for which, during which you discovered most oil was the 1960s. Since the 1960s, in the 1970s, was found less oil than the 60s. In the 80s was found less oil than the 70s. In other words, since the 60s, the discoveries were on a downward sloping curve for 40 years. So, the point of this whole peak oil discussion is that there is a specific lag since you actually find the oil to pump it. And if you, at a certain point, maximize your discoveries, roughly 30 or so years later, 35 years later, you maximize the quantity of output per day. This is a geological issue. Of course, there is some economics, but this is a geological issue that is driven with decades. This is not something that happened in the late 1990s and in early 2001. This is something that is based on roughly 30, well by now 40 years of geological history, and that's what's important to understand. Now, because discoveries peaked in the 60s, it doesn't mean that we are consuming more than we are finding. That happened in 1986. In other words, while discoveries peaked in the 60s, consumption was less than what was discovered. Since then, discoveries started going down, but consumptions went up. So, in 1986 was discovered just as much as was consumed. So in 1987 and beyond, up until the present day, the world has discovered on a yearly basis less oil for the year than was actually consumed. So, whatever is the oil in the ground, you think about it in terms of inventory. You discover, which adds to the inventory, and you consume, which subtracts from the inventory. So, you can imagine is that in 1986, roughly, the inventories of crude oil peaked in the ground, and since then, the inventories have been shrinking. Well, it's a geological fact that as oil inventories shrink, you cannot keep accelerating the output because of, let's say, oil and gas pressures in the oil wells and other basic geological realities. So, no replenishment of what we've consumed over the last 20 years. All right, some basic oil field facts which I'll just fly through. Number one is you got to understand that there are 120 oil fields, only 120. We can just get a list of them. Matthew Simmons does that. Just see which are they that produce over 100,000 barrels of oil per day. And this represents half of the world's oil supply or output. All right? So, half of what we consume, the whole world, or half of what is produced, is coming exactly from 120 oil fields. So if you really want to understand what's going on with world's oil supply, you might as well focus on these 120 and simply try to understand them, and then the picture should be a lot clearer. Interestingly enough, 5 oil fields produce more than 500 million per day, and this is 1/5, meaning 20% of the world's oil supply. And these 15 oil fields are old, real old. Age 53 for an oil field is pretty much what is age 60 or age 70 for a human, meaning terribly old and rapidly deteriorating in quality. All right? So, finally, there is what's called the swing field. It's called Ghawar oil field in Saudi Arabia. You guys have any idea what's a swing field? It's coming out of game theory. Have you guys studied in micro a swing vote? You know, one group is for this vote, the other group is for that vote, and that person sitting in the middle, because votes are equal, whatever he votes will determine whether the vote goes to this side or the vote goes to that side. So, the median, effectively, that's what it turns out to be from micro theory, right? So it's the median voter theorem, right? All right, so similar logic applies to the median oil field or the swing field. This simply says, as long as the Ghawar oil field, which is the largest oil field in the world and in Saudi Arabia, keeps increasing its output, world's output will roughly increase. And if Ghawar field simply begins to reduce its output, this means that the world's output will go down. Well, there are some indications. I don't want to get into the politics of how some of the top geologists in the world actually get their information. Usually, top geologists in the world will have 40 or 50 top students, and these, because they're top, go to work where? Saudi Aramco. So, nobody can get the official information, but you get to produce or a generation of top oil geologists. They get to work for a decade or two in Saudi Aramco, and they get to tell you in a little letter, well, things aren't what they are portrayed or given. The reality is this. And then you have that guy back trying and piecing the picture back together, because Saudi Aramco, for purely political reasons, will not willingly disclose the reality of the situation. Well, they wouldn't disclose anything, so you got to figure out from hundreds of different sources to piece the picture together. Alright, so the basic result at this point over the last 4 or 5 years is that there is no spare capacity left in the world. In other words, we have reached roughly 100% capacity utilization. The world was running for the last couple of years in about 99 or 99.5% capacity utilization. A little surge in demand, and the price skyrockets, and a little shrinkage of supply because there was something happening in Nigeria, and you get, again, the price skyrocketing. The price would skyrocket, meaning rise a lot percentage-wise, while supply shrinks a little because of what? Inelasticity. Inelasticity of oil demand. So, whether I got to drive back home on Friday, whether gasoline is, let's say, 2 lever or 250 or 3, I just got to drive back home, all right? Similarly for many, let's say, American workers or a lot of people, they just got to get in the car and drive to work. There is no public transportation. In this sense, demand for oil is extremely inelastic. This means that a little shrinkage of the supply will result in a lot of increase in the price. Roughly, I've heard estimates, that's where econometrics gets good. The estimate for an elasticity of roughly 7 to 10. This means that only 1% of reduction in the supply of oil will result in a 10% spike in the price, roughly. All right, so where we are? Well, decline. Decline means that no matter how much you want it, or wish, or try, or order to management to pump more, if it ain't there, you can't get it. And if there is no pressure, you can't make pressure. Well, there's water injection and other stuff. That's geology I don't want to get into. But the reality is that Alaska has been a major producer. Well, of course, not as major as Saudi Arabia, but it has rapidly declined, it is declining, and it just cannot increase its production. There you have Mexico, same thing, a major oil producer in the world. Well, Mexico's supply has been steadily declining at very disconcerting rates, 10, 15, 20% decline rates. Decline rate simply means that this year, we're going to be producing, let's say, 15% decline rate, 50% less than what we were producing last year. And next year, we're producing 50% less than this year. I mean, you got to understand how rapidly supply shrinks. And similarly for Kuwait, US, Britain, Russia, Libya, and Oman. So, most of the countries in the world are already past their peak. The latest estimate that I heard from last weekend was that roughly 75% of all countries, meaning oil-producing countries in the world, are past their peak, and roughly 75% of oil fields are also past their peak. We have a chart. Let's try to pull out the third chart and see if we can get, yes, that's the chart I was looking for. So see, this is a real chart with real data of world oil production in an area, specific area, tends to rise and then decline as geological limits are reached. The blue here is US, it's called the lower 48 states, that's how it's known. So, supply was, or US was pumping almost 5 million at the end of World War II. US supply reached from 5 million barrels per day all the way to 9.25 by 66 or 67. And then, no matter who's the president, no matter what the economic policy, decline is relentless. This blip here is when oil prices shot up from $5 or $10 all the way to $40 in a matter of 2 years by early 1980, and then it's been steady and relentless decline. So what you have to understand is that geology is the limit. It provides the limit. There is nothing we can do, no matter how great econometrics model we do. It's in the ground. Second is the North Sea. There it is. You see a rapid increase of output, and then you have a very rapid reduction of supply. It has been since even more rapidly declining. And the third example is that of the Alaskan fields. Again, same old story. This, you pump a little bit and you ramp up. You reach the peak soon, and then steady decline since. The important to understand from this chart is that these are not some weird examples. This is the typical example. The typical example for any oil field, or for any country's total output, or for any region for that matter. So that's how nature works. That's why economists have been typically getting the picture wrong all the time. These are limitations that are imposed by nature. And no matter how good you are at cranking models, it's not going to fix it. All right, let's get back to our presentation and see what's next. All right, which are still the countries that can pump some more? Well, Iraq. I don't need to discuss any of that. Iran, again, you know all the instability and currently the pre-war temperament. Nigeria, well, they've been constantly in flux, uprisings and whatnot, riots, again. And finally, Venezuela, that may have actually changed since my presentation. By now, Venezuela is considered to have reached its peak, to be past its peak, and its supply falling. And finally, there are different types of crude oil. Crude oil is not just crude oil. There is light, sweet crude oil. There is heavy, sour crude oil. Light and heavy refers to its viscosity or ability to flow. Sweet and sour refers to the contents of sulfur. And light and sweet turns out to be easy to use and great. And heavy and sour requires phenomenal refining capacity. It causes phenomenal problems. The sulfur itself causes a lot of metal problems, rusting, etc. So, what is left in the world is mostly sour crude, and even if we can pump it, the world has not enough capacity to actually refine it and convert it into a usable product. Alright, so what are the typical peak oil objections? Like Dan Jurgen from Sarah, well, they just say oil is plentiful. Of course, that's the easiest. Well, oil is plentiful. There is plenty of oil. Different statement is there are hundreds of billions of dollars of oil in the ground. The answer is no one is saying that oil is scarce. And I never said this today, did I? I'm saying that the supply of oil is scarce relative to its demand. We're talking about relative scarcity. So, yes, it is absolutely true we have hundreds of billions of dollars of barrels in the ground, but the problem is that we can't pump it faster. That's the problem that we've been facing for many years now. So the problem, yes, sure, and numbers they say are old and inaccurate. Well, again, there is a lot of political talk, but I don't want to get into that. Still, reality is oil was roughly $10 10 years ago. Now is today at least 100. So if oil price went up 10 times in dollar terms, dollar has fallen roughly twice since then. So in real terms, if oil is up roughly 5 times, there has got to be some fundamental demand and supply factor underneath. Of course, brick is one of them. All right, so in the 70s, what you have to understand, the oil crisis, we had 2 oil crises, one in 73, 74, the other one was in 79. Both of them were based on politics, Yom Kippur War, Americans getting themselves into the war, and Muslims, responding back. I don't want to get into, Israeli war, but the idea was that back then OPEC decided to shrink output, to cut output. And that was the driver of skyrocketing prices back then. Today, however, the story is different. OPEC would love to pump more and get $100 for it. They would love. They make phenomenal profits. They just can't, all right? That's important to understand. What they say is, well, we've had energy problems before. In the 16th century it was wood, but the world shifted to coal. In the 19th century it was coal, the world shifted to oil. Well, no one in the peak world, meaning the experts in peak world, is saying, oh, peak oil supply is going down and civilization will go down the drain with it. No, nobody's saying that. All they're saying is, hey, we can't pump more than what we really need in terms of demand, so prices will go up. Sure, within 2 or 3 decades, we will have built out the infrastructure for alternatives. Do we have alternatives? Yes, of course. We do have plenty of them. Nuclear and whatnot. I might get to that a little later. But the point is not that civilization will die and will stop to exist, is that it's going to take a couple of transitional decades, roughly 2 to 3 decades, because you need a completely different infrastructure. Best example is hydrogen. We have hydrogen engines, they're very efficient and all the good stuff. The problem is we got to replace 1 billion engines, which are currently running on gasoline and diesel, and 1 billion engines require a lot of steel, a lot of factories. Well, we got the hydrogen, but you got to produce the hydrogen. You got to transport the hydrogen. You got to store the hydrogen. You see, there's a lot of problems. So this infrastructure isn't going to be taken care of within 5 years. Probably not 10. Solutions will take anywhere, and estimates range, but roughly some of the top guys in the world agree that between 15 and 25 years there will be, well, there are today resolutions, but it will take 15 to 25 years to implement them. Is that fairly clear? Does it make sense? How much time? Well, 15 minutes, I think I can handle. Alright, so, what are the alternatives? I don't want to get into alternative energy. If that's the case, you really got to take a resource economics course or some energy type course. But wind is a working alternative. The problem is that wind delivers roughly 1% of our energy needs. We can double wind energy, but it's going to go from 1 to 2%. It is negligible at this point. It will be more and more and more important. It is good, efficient, and everything else, but it is negligent. In order to have any meaningful effect for wind, you need a couple of decades. Hydro, yes, a lot of countries still have the hydro resources, but again, it takes an awful lot of capital to build hydroelectric power, and then you got to think how you're going to convert the electricity into, to get to work the car. I mean, now I say we got electric cars, right? But the problem is, you got to build again 1 billion cars. I mean, just in the U.S. you have what, 300 million cars by now? In Europe, 300-400 million cars by now. I mean, you got to replace 1 car at a time, 1 car at a time. So, solar, yes, this has great potential. No doubt it will be part of the solution. It will not be the solution. Solar again's got barely 1 or 2% of total energy needs. You can increase it 5 times in maybe 10 years, but from 1% to 5%, not a long-term solution. You got to understand, each of these represents a little piece of the larger solution. You get each of these from 1 to 5%, from 1 to 5%, from 1 to 5%, and when you add them all up, you will get to a meaningful solution. But each of these would require phenomenal capital structure. Well, what does it mean, phenomenal capital structure? It means a lot of production, a lot of savings, possibly a number of recessions to build the savings out in order to generate the capital to rebuild the capital structure. All right, natural gas is clearly not the long-term solution. Anyone in the field, expert in the field, knows and understands that natural gas is subject to the same peak oil concept. Some are even saying that we are right around natural gas peak. They call it gas peak. Maybe we're 5 years away. This is irrelevant for the long-term analysis. For the long term, it is not a solution. Pretty much everybody agrees in it. Shale oil is also not a solution. Again, I don't want to get into the explanation of what is shale oil, but it's thick, it's hard, it's like sand, it's also similar to oil sands. You got to get to use a lot of energy to convert it back to regular oil. It presents a lot of difficulties. Not a meaningful solution. It will be part of the solution, but not a meaningful. Nuclear. Yes, this is a proven technology that humanity has used for many decades, more like 4 decades. France is the leading country in the world. 70% of its energy needs are coming out of nuclear. So yes, nuclear can be a meaningful solution, but you get to the problem of what? Peak uranium. All right, so uranium is a problem. And the other problem with, well, it's not a big problem with nuclear, but we're facing it today in Bulgaria, is that one nuclear reactor, meaning more like a nuclear station that generates in Bulgaria, how much are the Russians going to build it for us?
2 billion, 1 billion.
Oh, no, more like 5 billion. One reactor is 1 or 2 billion. So you get the whole thing, and it is like 5 or 10 billion. Well, we don't have that kind of savings. The whole Bulgarian banking system doesn't have the capital, all right? You got to understand, we got to save and not consume for 10 years just to build that one single nuclear power generator, let alone build out the whole world in it. Pebble bed reactors have 7 layers of protective technology. This means you can break through all 6 of them, and it's still not going to cause any environmental or other safety risks. So, pebble bed reactors have been developed in Belgium and used in South Africa. They work very well. They are phenomenally safe. Odds of a bad problem coming out of it are 1 in hundreds of billion. Pretty much they say the odds are 1 in a billion to go through 3 of the layers of protection, let alone all 7 of them. So this is considered to be perfectly safe, but the capital structure to build out for the whole world, then you can imagine you got to build 1,000 nuclear stations, and each of them requiring 5 to 10 billion. Multiplying, you see that we're talking about huge capital. And finally, alternatives or technology. This, guys, you have to understand. Econ and business guys just seem not to have any physics anymore. Technology does not create energy. You guys understand that? Energy is not created out of a vacuum. Energy must exist, and technology can transform it, channel it, or do something else with it. Technology is not a solution to energy simply because technology, you cannot create energy out of nothing. That's one of the, basic laws, right? So, every time you hear someone telling you that technology is going to solve some of our energy problems, you gotta know right away, this guy is a fluke, meaning this guy is talking stuff we just want to hear. This guy is extremely incompetent, or politically or some other way monetarily motivated. In other words, he's talking the things that someone is paying him to talk. But anytime you hear technology as a solution, you gotta know something's wrong, dead wrong. Technology does not and cannot ever possibly create energy. Alright, so what are the basic consequences? Well, you're the investment club. This means steadily rising prices. That's what you want to know, and therefore probably maybe speculate. It also means increased volatility. Well, if you guys known or heard, well, we can pull up a chart. Maybe this guy can pull up a chart. Go to stockcharts.com on the browser and just pull up WTIC, crude oil. See, phenomenal. Just the other day, was it like 2 days ago? Oil went up $4.50, almost $5 up. That's shocking volatility, 5% volatility in one day. Just 10 trading days ago, oil was what? 87.5. Now it's 100. So WTIC, okay, great. You see, it was $88 in early February. Let's zoom in here. 86. And you see that from 86, it has gone down to to 100 plus. This is roughly $14. $14 on an 86 basis gives you almost 20%. 20% move in 2 weeks is phenomenal volatility. Oh, by the way, from 100 going down to 86, that's roughly 20% move. On the way down, the proportion is 14%. 14% down move in roughly 2 or 3 weeks. Again, this indicates phenomenal volatility. Similar again from 86 to 100. We call this 100 resistance, resistance, resistance. Today is trying to push through and break out of this resistance. I don't want to get into technical analysis today. So let's get back to the peak oil and see what else we have. Volatility, increased vulnerability. Hugo Chavez is saying, hey, I don't want to pump any more oil for the Americans, and he's making his deals with China. Well, why isn't he simply, once he makes his deals, cut off the America and send it to China right away, tomorrow morning? Well, he actually handshake with the Chinese president, what's the name, Hu Jintao, the previous one. He handshaked, he cut the deal. And he wants to do it. Hu Jintao wants to do it for China, but they don't do it. Why? Yes, that's the bonus point for the guy. Not sufficient infrastructure. Insufficient. Yes, Hugo Chavez is building out his infrastructure on his end, and the Chinese are busy to build theirs on their end, okay? And they will eventually, probably very soon, within a year or two, but they can't just shake hands and shift over the oil flow from the US to China. Building out the infrastructure may take 1 to 3 years. I think the initial estimate was for 2. I don't have any new updates on that. So, what else? Increased vulnerability. Well, Nigeria. Anytime anything happens in Nigeria, and it happens actually all the time, the result is oil spikes. So you constantly get in the media that problems in Nigeria resulted today in an oil spike. Well, media never get to look back more than a year ago. Well, they don't look back even 2 days ago, typically. So, no offense to anyone here in journalism. But they cannot simply see that that crude has been up 7 or 8 times in the last 7 or 8 years, or 10 times in the last 10 years. So, it has got to be something more than some problem in Nigeria, all right? There's got to be some other problems. All right, so same thing with Sudan or whatnot. Alright, next thing is consequences for energy security. At least the current capital infrastructure means that energy security is or becomes equivalent to oil security. Oil security is strategic for or vital for the economy, for the nation, and therefore it becomes or dominates foreign policy. And as a consequence, you know the Afghanistan story, the Iraq story, and we're all watching developments in Iran, constantly on and off, on and on and off. But you got to understand, and I don't think it's anymore a mystery to anyone in the world that this whole on-off thing with Iran is about oil. All right, so 60% imported oil. This is U.S.-centric statement. In other words, the U.S. itself imports 60% of its oil. So skyrocketing oil prices rapidly exacerbate U.S. trade deficits. This has other consequences and implications. You're welcome to International Finance course to hear details about them. Ultimately, peak oil will force conservationism. This simply says, if the US, Europe, and the rest of the world do not impose on themselves to conserve, nature will do it for them. So nature will most likely impose on all of us to conserve. And there are some other environmental issues. You're an investment club. The assumption is you're interested on how to make money. You don't care about, well, maybe you do, but the question is the price of oil going to go up or down? So here I'll just skip the environmental issues. Solutions, yes, one of them is conservation. Number two is deglobalization. If the globalization means shipping from one country to another, so a lot of goods flow that consumes a lot of the world's energy output. So deglobalization will drastically reduce consumption and therefore demand for oil. Fuel efficiency, rather than producing more BMW M5, which we all like, we'd rather stick to M3 and be happy, right? What is it? Alternatives, I discussed some of them. More info. Here is something I was not quite aware or wasn't as aware 2 years ago. Peakoil.net is a very good website, but the best site in the world today, far beyond anything else, is called The Oil Drum. The Oil Drum. Just www.theoildrum, nothing in between, .net.org, I'm not sure. Alright, so that's what it is. Who are the top guys in the world? Matthew Simmons, an investment banker, very honest, highly reputable. He's got a terrific book, Twilight in the Desert, that anyone that will be interested more in oil, energy, etc. must read. I have heard tons of things about it, that it was the greatest book ever on the subject. I got to read it this summer. Indeed, it was, for me, eye-opening book. Ken DeFace is another guy. Michael Clare looks into the geopolitical sides of things, and William Engdahl also on the geopolitical side of things, and Colin Campbell, also a top guy in the world. I would recommend to any or all of you to watch I think it's a 1-hour documentary called Crude Reality. We did it in public finance because it's got some other implications. Crude Reality, great movie, by all means watch it. Finally, over the last year in 2007, 2 other documentaries came out. Very good. They don't get too deep into the problem, but Crude Reality is really, really good. And it is amazing that these guys have been able to get the best of the best in the world on the field, meaning in this particular field. Conclusion, well, I'll give you the floor for questions. Any questions or anything? Investment club. What are the typical concerns of investors today? Come on, guys. Any questions? Any problems? Well, I'd like to thank you for attending my lecture. If you're interested or have some more questions later, just send me an email.